Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome again to Syriana Analysis. I'm your host, Kevork Almassian. Thank you very much for tuning into this live streaming. I appreciate you all, guys. I personally watched the interview, 2 hours long interview today in the morning with a cup of coffee, and personally, I enjoyed it. Probably you agree or disagree with the content and the statements made by Vladimir Putin, but overall, it was a very good interview. This is my humble opinion about it. It could have been better, of course. However, in the current circumstances, with the immense pressure that was exerted over Tucker Carlson for being more challenging and confrontational, let's say, with Vladimir Putin, there were high expectations from both sides on him. It was overall very good. This is just my humble opinion. However, we're going to discuss and analyze this interview, assuming that you guys already watched this interview, which was watched by over 120 million people only on X, formerly known on Twitter. And for that, I'm joined by Shay Bose. He's a brilliant Irish journalist based in Moscow. Thank you so much, Shay, for accepting my invitation. It's a really pleasure to have you. And Gordon, thank you so much being my guest again, brother from the United States. You're the co-host of Badlands Daily. Guys, the links for X, their accounts in the description below, and also the Rumble podcast of Gordon is also in the description below. Gordon, I'm going to start this with you. After watching the 2-hour-long interview, was the meltdown of legacy media and hysteria of Western politicians justifiable, taking into consideration that this content has been posted on X, and there is now a serious attempt by the Elon Musk and X to, let's say, cancel or to suppress the reach of the mainstream media by posting more content, political content, and interviews like this on X.
Yes. I think. Well, thank you for having me. First of all, Che, great to see you. I was also happy with the interview, like overall. I think it was a positive. The net effects of the interview, I think, were good. I give Putin an A+ for his ability to convey information within the interview. Tucker, I think, could have been a little better. I was a little disappointed with how he had handled himself. Over at Badlands Media, we have a few dozen people working over there, and we've been talking about this for the past week, the build up to it, and we've been discussing how this had the opportunity to be a real game changer, like a real like pivot point in this era, this like little short history we're living in right now, the past 10 years or so, where of the public's understanding of what's happening. I do think that this was a very positive push in that direction, and I think that's why the media and the establishment has been freaking out about it. I do think it could have been way better. I do think it could have been way more severe if Tucker had crafted his questions better and been a little less hostile. Like, I think the idea of going in there and being a little confrontational with Putin was the wrong approach. Oliver Stone did a series of interviews back in, I think, between 2015 and 2017. It was 4 interviews, 1 hour each. The only problem with those interviews is that they weren't overdubbed in English, meaning that Putin responded in Russian and they just did subtitles. So there are a lot of Americans who are not going to sit there for 4 hours and read, 4 hours of subtitles. So I think Oliver Stone should go back now and do what Tucker did and overdub in English, because I think it would reach a lot more people. But Oliver Stone was able to in my opinion, I think he was able to ask Putin harder questions, but he was also able to cultivate kind of like a friendship or at least like a mutual admiration with Putin. Putin seemed to genuinely respect him. There seemed to actually be like a genuine fondness, and because of that, Putin was more relaxed and way more open, and it just seemed to be like a way more sincere and amiable conversation between Putin and Oliver Stone. Whereas there was like a palpable tension in the room between Putin and Tucker, and it had to do with the fact that when Tucker, he flew all the way to Russia, Putin tells him, "You have as much time as you need. I'm not going to give you a time limit." And then Tucker asks him, "All right, why invade Ukraine?" And Putin starts giving him the history of Ukraine. And as Tucker explained in his intro to the interview, he said, at first, when he started doing this, I got very frustrated because I thought he was wasting time and filibustering and stalling. but he wasn't. He was trying to provide context to the American audience, who 99.9% of American audiences know nothing about Russian history. They barely know European history, like let alone Russian history, which is far more complex than European history. And so he was trying to explain, just give a very, very brief overview. He did a great job. In like 15, 20 minutes, he nailed like over 1,000 years of Russian history.
I mean, if you compare it to one of the candidates now for presidency in the United States, Nikki Haley, when she didn't know the answer about why the Civil War started in the United States, the historical context that Putin gave was really impressive. Shay, brother, do you agree with the notion that Tucker was more challenging than expected, or it was more like let him talk style from Tucker Carlson's side? Was there any question that Tucker should have asked, but he didn't, in your opinion?
I think I agree and disagree, but I think the key here for me was this was about Putin seeing an opportunity. People are talking about this is Tucker Carlson's opportunity. Tucker, should have done this, should have done that. I don't think Putin is really, I don't think the world needs to worry about Tucker's behavior in the interview. Remember, even someone like Tucker Carlson can get a bit dumbstruck sitting in the room with someone like Putin. Putin's decades at the top of Russian politics, world politics. He's met innumerable presidents. I mean, this is a guy that's like probably the arch strategist, if you like, and that's what he's seen as here. I think this was about Putin. And I think Putin showed that by when Tucker asked this question, which was kind of a drive-through question. Okay, why did you invade Ukraine? Putin said, hold on, that's not where we're starting. Putin was very much in control here in that he said, that's not where we're starting, Tucker. We're going to start at the beginning. Because I think Putin saw this as an opportunity to talk directly into the living rooms and into the ear pods and onto the phones of tens of millions of people. That's what he's done. He said, I'm going to take you back to, take this apart like a Lego set and bring you back through it, to build back to the moment when we, intervened in Ukraine. So I think that's important. And I think could Tucker, I see some flashes of the old Tucker Carlson there, some giggles, some, the part when he says, who blew up Nord Stream? I mean, Tucker's questions were very simplistic. Yes. I mean, if I was Tucker Carlson and I got to sit with Putin and ask those questions, I would have said, I would have drawn and coaxed Putin into saying what he was going to say anyway, which is, what is the background here? People have said that you've alleged that Ukraine isn't, a real country. Why did you say that? Try and bring him along and dance with him through the questions a bit more. I think I was surprised at Tucker Carlson's first question is, why did you invade Ukraine? In my view, it was playing to a very simplistic, agenda. Whereas, of course, Putin said, no, hold on. You said you were going to have a serious discussion with me, not a talk show. So we're going to have that serious discussion. And Putin was very much like the school teacher. Sit down, you're going to listen, and then we're going to talk more about everything else. I do think the part about the history piece, which, of course, pro-Ukrainians and revisionists are all going to challenge, he got this wrong, he got that wrong. Quite a remarkable display of mental agility from a man with no notes. I mean, and he's known for that here. I've seen the press conferences where he sat, no notes, unscripted, and he can parry and, deal with questions. I mean, it's just another league compared, whether you agree with his politics, whether you disagree, a total other league than European politics, the way it's run, the scripted narratives. We saw what happened when unscripted questions get asked to people like Joe Biden today when he was asked, his age, and he got very in the same sentence then confused Mexico with Egypt. It's just remarkable. Yeah. So what this was about, in my view, was Vladimir Putin, not Tucker Carlson, seeing an opportunity. I mean, there was a sort of a discussion a while back. Well, would Jackson Hinkle, this young American guy, very popular on YouTube, would he get to interview Putin? There was no way Jackson Hinkle was going to sit in a room with Vladimir Putin. That was never going to happen. No. Tucker Carlson is seen as somebody credible here among the Russian population. And remember, Vladimir Putin was also talking to 150, 160 million Russians in here and across the world. Huge Russian diaspora in the States, in Europe. And he was talking to everybody. He was saying, look, this is my position. He wasn't going to get this soapbox again for a long time, although this may be the start of a series of interviews, who knows. But I think it's important that people realize that Vladimir Putin and the Kremlin only did this because they believed they could talk directly to sensible, centrist, sort of liberal, ordinary people and short circuit this absolutely ludicrous propaganda machine, which is now, as you say, having a complete meltdown because a journalist actually did some journalism. Wow.
Yeah.
A journalist did his job. I mean, we've seen people like Dan Rather interviewing Saddam Hussein. We've seen, during the Second World War, people fawned all over Hitler. We've seen innumerable interviews with US presidents who've killed 10 million individuals since the end of the Second World War. No one has a problem with that. What the key points for me about the whole thing are, this was Putin getting a chance to talk directly to people and demonstrate, in my view, how plausible, sentient, capable, responsible, and absolutely focused on rapprochement that this guy was. Tucker did try to draw him into some adversarial kind of stuff, like on multipolarity, on the rise of the South, you're going to beat the dollar back. And Putin consistently, if you read into what he was saying, was consistently saying, look, I'm not going to, this is not what it's about. When he mentioned the global South, multipolarity, Putin said it's actually two sides of a brain. And when two sides of a brain can't work with each other, that's called an illness. He was suggesting that this schism globally is bad for everybody. He was also talking about peace and the pathway back to peace, saying we did, agree a deal with the Ukrainians. And he went into detail about this. I wrote about that at the time, and people said I was insane. That never happened. Of course it happened. There was a peace deal, which was scuppered by Johnson. We know that. And we also know that, that could have been used in a much more adversarial way. Like Vladimir Putin would say, you're bombing our ports, you're assassinating people in our territory, you're killing our people, blah, blah, blah. He could have played it like the Americans, but he didn't. He said, look, I understand you've probably screwed this up so badly to such an extent that you have no idea how to get out of this. Okay? Yeah. I understand that. You've drank a bottle of vodka, you've smashed the house up, you've run out in the garden, you've no trousers on, and now you're running around thinking, how the fuck am I going to get back where I need to be? So he sort of reached out, I think, in the interview and said, look, we're trustworthy partners. We can work with you. He talked about other times when Russia tried to reach out, but their hand was slapped away by the West. So I think this was a very conciliatory move from Putin. I think if you look beneath the lines, I think, could Tucker have pressed him more? I personally think Tucker seemed a little bit starstruck. He seemed a little bit out of his league. He didn't know whether he could push too hard. He didn't know. He couldn't find his rhythm. It's like a great footballer. It just wasn't a great game for him. He couldn't get into that little rhythm where he could start hitting the points and get this rapprochement going, or this, what's the word? This vibe going with the guy, because this is a very serious man, a very serious individual with a sort of obviously a humorous side, and we saw that. But I think the key to really remember here is this is seen by Putin as a huge opportunity to overturn 2 years of absolutely delusional, dishonest propaganda about Russia. And, if you notice one thing, Putin didn't talk about Vladimir Putin. He talked about Russia, he talked about Russian history. He talked about the Ukrainian people as being a very brotherly people here with the Russians and anybody who's lived here or does live here. I have, I'd say, a dozen friends here who are Ukrainians. Some still have their Ukrainian passport. I don't know anybody here who's Russian who doesn't have a Ukrainian relative or friend. The line where Russia ends and Ukraine begins is very much blurred and very artificial, as Putin said, particularly in eastern Ukraine. So these are realities that really needed to be demonstrated and talked about. And that's why I think he took so long to talk about that. And he actually gave him the evidence. I mean, it might not be a very sexy Western way to do business, but it kind of in the Russian way, they say, if we're going to talk about this, let's talk about it on the basis of facts. I'm going to give you the facts, and I'm going to give you the documents to back up the facts, and then we can talk about supposition and maybe. He also used one more thing, which I thought was fascinating. He used a term like, and Carlson said, I can see you're very bitter. And Putin said, look, bitterness is for married couples. He said, I'm not bitter about anything. The Russians don't do these overt displays of emotion. They're just not like that.
Yeah.
Putin thinks in years and decades, I think. You know, the Chinese think in centuries, but the Russians are very, their default position on all things is skepticism. I think, first of all, being a foreigner working here in the media, I know that, you know, it takes time to build trust with people here. There's a much higher level and bar of political and historical understanding among ordinary Russians than there is in Europe or in the United States. It's just a thing. And I think that's how you see that this was Putin playing this interview on his terms. I'm the boss, you know, I'm why they're here. And I'm going to make sure I tick the boxes of what I want people to understand about my position here and the Russian position. I personally think he did a very good job of that. I know what people are saying when they say it was a little bit labored from Tucker Carlson. But I mean, I think it might have got to him. I think the occasion might have got to him. I think he might have found, you know, he's not talking to a guy who said he met Barack Obama in a men's toilets. He's talking to the president of a superpower. It's a very different. He's not talking to Donald Trump, who he backslaps and plays golf with. This is a different day out. And I think when Putin started his sort of history lesson for the world's audience, I think Carlson really knocked him off balance a bit. He thought, okay, I think that's why he had to preface the interview with this note saying, look, I didn't know he was going to actually give us some facts. So Jimmy Dore and, you know, Saturday Night Live, it wasn't, but it was very interesting. And it was interesting as well, from the last thing I'll say, was how comfortable Vladimir Putin seems to be now with the situation going forward. He's, you know, why would I go and talk to them? Vladimir Putin is exceptionally astute. He knows that the West is in big trouble financially. Ukraine is in big trouble. You know, Zelensky sacked yesterday. This is a good week for Vladimir Putin. It's a good week for Russia, but it's not about good weeks for the Russians. It's about, you know, it's like everything here. The industrial complex that's spun up now in Russia, this vast machine, which the muscle memory in Russian economy to make huge amounts of materiel and armored vehicles and shells, that has now spun up. It's warmed up and it's moving forward. It's grinding forward. This vast industrial base here. And on the basis of that, the Russians would be more confident. They don't do confidence on the spin of a tail or on a day or a week. But the sense here in Russia is very much that it's now the West that are going to have to find a way to reach a rapprochement with Russia, as Ukraine seems to be in a slow motion collapse. You know, I don't predict that Ukraine will collapse or the war will stop or the fighting will end. I don't know. The fighting could go on for years. But there's definitely a sense here that, you know, it's going to be difficult for Russia to lose now, considering the issues in the Middle East, considering the lack of funding, you know. So, you know, the Russians don't do bragging, but, you know, you can feel it in the discourse now. And I think Putin was very much like that. Look, he even handed out, he said, look, we'll be honest partners. We're not going to rub your nose in it. If you want to end it, stop giving them the weapons. Let's sit down and we'll do business. But it was very clear. These territories are now Russian. They are part of the Russian Federation now. They're considered as Russia. I can tell you now, there's two ways that Crimea would come back into Ukrainian control, and they would have to be done by force. The Russians will fight to the last man in Crimea. They will never, no more than the Americans will give up Washington, New York, Seattle. They will never give up Crimea because they don't consider they ever lost it. The people of Crimea are Russian as far as they're concerned. And we know that the Americans have written in their internal intelligence briefings that the whole population of Crimea is Russian, vastly Russian. Though reality is that. And it's this, I think what's happened in the West is they've talked themselves, they've believed their own propaganda. They did it with this counteroffensive, which I can persistently suggest it could never, will never work. It didn't work. But it's moving now. It's so reactionary for the West. And I think Putin sensed that and he said, look, they've bricked themselves into a corner with this acceleration. They've lost the sanctions battle. They're losing the military battle. The populations in Europe and the United States are sick of Ukraine. They're tired of it. They don't want to fund it anymore. It's fallen off the news agenda. So there has to be a way out here. But the way out cannot be an overt defeat for Ukraine. I think that was the interesting way. So it's those subtle messages, I think actually Putin was using this as a platform to say to the West, look, we can make it so nobody loses, but the weapons have to stop flowing. We have to come to an arrangement, and we move forward from that. That's my view of it.
Yeah. Gordon, at the beginning of this interview, Putin gave a very long historical context, as we addressed now. And then he also addressed the history of Ukraine during World War II and the some of the elements in Ukraine that were allies with the Nazi Germany and this neo-Nazi scene that some of the remnants stayed in Ukraine, and then they were encouraged by some of the Western powers to use them against Russia as a fifth column or as a Trojan horse on the Western borders with Russia. However, he moved later to more complex issues. For example, what's happening nowadays, one of the unintended consequences of this, let's say, collective West sanctions regime against Russia was that Russia and China started to come closer and closer and closer, something that, in my opinion, the Western, the NATO side didn't give much attention to it or much planning before they imposed these sanctions. So Tucker tried to not to trick, let's say, Putin, but he asked him the question like, don't you think that China eventually will dominate over the BRICS economic bloc, and this will lead into the Russian economy will be dominated by China? And Putin said, he ridiculed this question, and he said, it's a boogeyman story. I'm quoting him here. Do you share his opinion here, or do you think eventually the rise of China and the need of Russia during this discourse of this war will eventually lead to some dependency, economic dependency on Russia from on China from the Russian side?
No, I mean,
I think the whole globe is dependent on China.
Yeah.
So that's where I'd start. You know,
including America. Well, you bring up a great point, and Shay brings up a great point as well, because he's talking about how this is all about Putin and not really about Tucker, and I agree. So here's where we are in America. In America, especially Badlands, we understand this, and we're pushing this very hard. We are in basically like a civil war in America. We have been since Trump came down the escalator and announced he was going to run for president. And what we're trying to defeat, the civil war, is between the people, all of us, including the Democrats, like the Democrat voters, even those who still don't understand that we're in a war and that the enemy is actually this monster that is in Washington, D.C. And the monster in Washington, D.C. is the thing that Putin is fighting in Ukraine. And that's the CIA. And that's the deep state, as it's called, like the cute name they give it on television is the deep state. But really what it is the CIA. And it's tied to the Third Reich, which we talked about the last time I came on your show. We talked about how Assad had mentioned that, how deals were cut with the leadership of the Third Reich. And those who cut the deals were brought over to D.C. and formed the CIA, formed NASA, formed the elements that we now call the deep state. And then through the CIA, they used that agency to topple foreign governments through color revolution throughout the 20th century and turn basically the entire world into a system of vassals with the U.S. State Department at the top of the pyramid. So we don't really have allies in America. We just have vassals who are beholden to the State Department. They get foreign aid, hundreds of billions of dollars in foreign aid. And so they use that as the carrot. And then if the carrot doesn't work, they use the stick in the form of the revolution in the U.S. military. So that's what we're fighting against. And now that system, that the CIA system, has now been turned and weaponized against the American people. And propaganda has been saturating us for the past 12 years, really longer than that. But the past 12 years, it has been hyper intense, like hyper intensified. Yeah. So at Badlands, we're trying to wake people up and get them to realize who our real enemy is. Our enemy isn't China. Our enemy isn't Russia. Our enemy isn't Iran. Our enemy is the CIA, is the people in our government who are committing treason right now and sedition against our people. And we have to wake up our neighbors and help them to realize this so that we can peacefully retake control of our own sovereignty the way that other countries are beginning to do that, like El Salvador. So with that said, I think Putin did a fantastic job of talking about the histories, both the ancient histories of Russia, the histories of the 20th century, and the CIA and the malevolence of the CIA, specifically in Ukraine. He talked about, there was a really, really important moment where he talks about once he came into power in 2000, going and meeting with George Bush Sr. And he said, and Tucker asked him, what year was this? And he said, go check the internet. You can figure it out. I forget what year it was. There were 3 times he went and stayed with the Bush family, 2001, 2007, and 2017. I think it was in 2001 and 2007, George Bush Jr. W was president. So in the 2007, I believe, article, it said that the MSN, the Western media, was reporting that George W. Bush had to go ask his dad permission for Putin to come stay with him and like visit him. And I think it's interesting that basically, despite the fact that George Bush Sr. at the time was retired from politics and like in retirement, basically, he was the guy that Putin said he had to go court and like talk to. And that's because George Bush Sr. was the godfather of the CIA. He was the godfather of the whole deep state at the time. He helped form the CIA. He was a big part of it. His father, Prescott Bush, we talked about this last time. Brown's brother Harriman, by the way, is the name of the bank you asked for last time. That was the bank that they used to launder money from the United States to the Third Reich. And that was George Bush Sr.'s father, George W. Bush's grandfather. He was charged with trading with the Enemies Act in 1942, and he would have gone to prison if it weren't for his friendships with the people who ultimately with him formed the CIA later after World War II. And so it's very interesting that then Putin goes on to talk. He's emphasizing over and over again, it's George Bush Sr., George Bush Sr. He's the one making decisions. He's the one I have to talk to. He's the one I had to court. And then he talks about the CIA overthrowing Ukraine in 2014 and taking control of the government with the color revolution, which is what they do all over the world. And he said that was the breaking point. At that point, I had no choice. Like NATO and the CIA had infiltrated Ukraine. They violated the treaty. I gave them every opportunity to stop, and they didn't. And then they set up, he didn't talk about this in the interview, but they set up secret bioweapons labs that we learned about last year. So, there's a lot of nefarious stuff that's happening in Ukraine. It's also, by the way, happening in the Middle East, all over the Middle East. We've talked about that before, Kevork. It's happening in America. The CIA, what the CIA is doing in Ukraine, it's also doing in the Middle East. It's also doing in Central America. It's also doing in the United States against the American people.
There's an interesting issue when you talk about the CIA. I mean, I've written a lot about this. I actually wrote my thesis about this. I go into it in my thesis for my master's in strategic studies. That the CIA project in Ukraine didn't begin in 2014 or 2006, 2007, or in 1991. The CIA's first operations in Ukraine happened immediately after the Second World War.
Yes.
Where operations Aerodynamic, Operation Red Sox, Operation Paperclip, there's numerous. Now, they were all failures. Most of them were failures in that the people that they parachuted in and the material and their emphasis were defeated. The Soviets, the KGB infiltrated them very, aggressively because they saw the threat. But if you look at those sort of projects in Ukraine was seen as a ripe sort of mark for the CIA because of this ethnic divide that was being aggressively cultivated by these radical nationalists, people like Stepan Bandera, who was eventually assassinated by the KGB in Germany, and Roman Shukevich, both of which feature very heavily in modern Ukrainian culture. They're on stamps. 1st of January in Ukraine is the birthday of Stepan Bandera. It's a national holiday. Because of that, there are innumerable hundreds of statues, streets named after these guys. So these are celebrated. There's even a college named after Roman Shukevich. Shukevich in particular was an interesting character in that he was a Hauptmann in the Nachtigall battalion, which is a punitive police battalion. They were tasked with rounding up ethnic Poles, Jews, Gypsies, and ethnic Russians, probably responsible for the deaths of over 200,000 people. Place like Babi Yar, place like the Voilin massacres. This is the UPA and the OUN, the Ukrainian national armies. And Putin goes into this sort of radical ideology of who Ukraine was, and it was quite complex. But in essence, the CIA funded these people.
Yes.
Now, to understand that, you got to say, well, got to just look. Recently, we saw Jake Sullivan's emails not so long ago saying, Al Qaeda is on our side in, Syria. There's nobody the CIA won't get into bed with, if it means achieving their goal. And Putin was quite wry about it last night. He said, look, they did their job. They overturned the government. They got a pro-Western government into power. We've all heard the Nuland phone call, where she made her thoughts clear about the EU. But the CIA project in Ukraine has been funded by billions of dollars, black money, I believe. And I've been told this by individuals I've spoken to, obviously off the record. It's very similar in Syria, Iraq, Libya, Afghanistan. Billions of dollars that are completely unaccounted for. I'd suggest anybody watching immediately go to the Costs of War, Brown University, and look at the work they've done on trying to track down and trace where the CIA gets its money from, where it goes. Parts of the budget is completely black. I've been told of, literal crates load of tons of US dollars being flown into the Middle East and distributed among the warlords. We don't know where the money goes. We don't know who spends it. We don't know who's bribed with it. We don't know how it works. And the American justice system is built around this capacity for an army within a state, which has got immense control of the media, as you say. I only tweeted today about this, the CIA project's Operation Mockingbird, how they controlled hundreds of journalists directly on the payroll. They printed hundreds of books. They infiltrated student unions, labor unions. They actually wrote articles for some mainstream journalists in the 70s, 80s, and in 90s. And anyone who believes that the CIA isn't intimately now involved in crafting the narrative about Ukraine, Syria, Libya, the Middle East, Yemen, and of course, Israel, anyone who can believe that is exceptionally naive and needs to really educate themselves about the reality of how the CIA operates. But to go back to the founding of these radical organizations, they were essentially defeated and crushed in the Ukrainian SSR, which was, remember, a breadbasket of the Soviet Union. The Donbass region was the biggest steel smelting, the Azovstal plant. This was a huge beating heart of the industrial capacity of the Soviet Union. That's why the CIA targeted it. The CIA wanted to stimulate a civil war. Very early reports from the CIA said, "We're no point in targeting Crimea because the population is absolutely Russian." And that's a very interesting document that's available on the US archive. You can see that they've done reports for decades, intelligence sort of analyses to say, well, where should we stir up trouble? And they very quickly understood that it was these borderlands in Western Ukraine where this radical ideology of a Ukrainian nationalism had found, prescience and had been, very eagerly adopted. Yaroslav Hunka, the man applauded in the Canadian Parliament by Zelensky and Trudeau, an SS trooper in the the 14th Galician SS. Now, remember, Hunka, like all of his fellow Ukrainians who joined the 14th Galician SS, were all volunteers. There was no conscription. Yes. So these men eagerly joined the most brutal, punitive killing battalions of the SS, and then were set to work by Himmler and local Gauleiters to cleanse land of ethnic Poles, Jews, Gypsies, and ethnic Russians. And thousands were killed in the most brutal way. The US immediately began to liaise with those very same entities and forces in the aftermath of the Second World War in order to destabilize and overturn the Ukrainian SSR purely because of its access to the Black Sea and its industrial capacity. It had nothing to do with freedom, liberty, or fighting the Red Menace. It's a fantasy, but that fantasy prevails still when people like John Kirby talk about Russia. Don't believe anything John or Vladimir Putin says if you watch that video. I can guarantee you that every single head of department in what is it? I think is 17 intelligence organizations in the US now are going through the interview with a tooth comb in very granular detail to see what is the messaging here, what's he trying to say, who is he speaking to. I can tell you that's absolutely happening tonight, as it's happening all over Europe. So the fact that people in the West, and particularly in the United States, still attach themselves to this drive-through narrative isn't surprising when you think of the trillions of dollars that have been spent to create this drive-through narrative, this absolute truth about China, about Russia, about anybody who challenges U.S. global hegemony. And it's very different. If you throw enough money at something, you tell a lie long enough and big enough, people start to believe it. Yeah. And good, hardworking taxpayer of the U.S. who is being impoverished by these wars, they're funding them. I know the U.S. Exchequer can just print more money, but it's not good for the economy. But the ordinary American, 40 million of which are living in poverty, are funding these wars against other ordinary working people. But in the case of Russia, it's just an absolute ludicrous sort of manifestation of ignorance. And that is a willful ignorance, which is fed by a vast propaganda machine, which in my view, if you see some of the attacks on Tucker Carlson from these so-called mainstream anchors, very low IQ people, I'd say exceptionally ill-educated about global issues and geopolitical reality.
They have the mind of children, basically.
Yeah, I mean, these people are, if anyone could suggest to me that they're not in the pay obliquely or directly of this centralized narrative, it's just like the same thing. Oh, Russia's unprovoked full-scale invasion of Ukraine. The BBC, CNN, ABC, CNBC, the Australian Broadcasting Network all began to use the exact same term within 7 days of each other. These are formed and centrally crafted narratives that are aimed at destroying debate before it begins. And that's why what happened yesterday, when the Russian president got to speak directly to those same people who have been fed this, this snowball roll by the CIA and thrown by these bleached-teethed, mainstream anchors. This is a grave challenge to that whole system of control. And it's controlled by osmosis. You get in your car, it's Russian genocide. It's in the background. It's on the TV. It's on the posters. It's on the walls. And it's a process of osmosis where people absorb this narrative. They never go looking for the real situation because they don't have the time. They're too busy trying to pay their taxes, raise their kids. So big chunks of it can go to keep these wars going. So I can understand why they're so angry. But watch who are the people being rolled out. And they're almost like self-identifying now as the main assets of this intelligence community. They've been told, get out there, do what you need to do to discredit this man. And so you can see who they are. And there's been a queue of people trying to be more outraged than the next. It's amazing how facts are so offensive to these people. It's like garlic to a vampire, it's remarkable.
It is. Yeah. Truth is not afraid of being challenged. The truth will stand firm. So,
Gordon, I wanted to ask you here, one of the famous American Twitter accounts called Clandestine said, I really wanted to see Putin go into detail on the degeneration of Western society, gender insanity, etc., because I think it would have resonated with the American people. And then I saw another post by Andrew Tate. He says, I think many expected a death blow to the USA establishment and the highlight of the culture war, and considering his competence, knowledge and experience, the most likely scenario that this didn't happen is simple. Galvanizing the American people to get their act together isn't good for Russia. America and the collective West are already acting exactly how he would want them to act. He quoted, finally, never interrupt your enemy when he is making a mistake, Napoleon Bonaparte. What do you say about this, Gordon? Like, how do you feel about that? Because many people also expected him to speak about this case, right?
Well, this kind of feeds into what I was saying about like how Tucker screwed this up, like why Tucker didn't do as well as he should have. Because I agree, this isn't about Tucker. It's just that Tucker failed to make this as powerful as it could have been because he didn't ask necessarily the right questions. He kept going back to these ridiculous narratives that were probably crafted by the CIA, then disseminated through the mainstream media. Because, like you said, Operation Mockingbird, Congress held like a congressional investigation and did a whole series of hearings in 1976, I think it was, exposed Operation Mockingbird as being 100% real, and it never ended. There was never any acknowledgement that it was going to end. It just probably kept growing. So I think it's safe to assume that every major media outlet in America probably is controlled by the CIA, either directly or indirectly. So yes, we have a major propaganda industry here in America. And to that point, I don't think, and this is what Putin told Oliver Stone years ago, I don't think Putin views the American people as his enemy. I really don't. I think he views the CIA and the people in Washington, D.C. who are trying to subvert him and overthrow the Ukrainian government and start World War III. I think he views them as his enemy for sure. But I don't think he views like America at large as like an enemy that he has to go to war with. So that's why I disagree with what Andrew Tate said. And I don't think that his intent is to necessarily destroy America. I think his intent is hopefully to defeat these bad actors, not only in America, but also internationally. They're in Europe as well. This Western hegemony that he talks about all the time, and Alexander Dugin talks about this all the time, the multipolar world. We at Badlands, we call it the regions of responsibility. One of the writers who started a series called Righteous Russia a month before the Ukrainian invasion started, where he compared Vladimir Putin to Trump and then did a whole series on it. He calls it the sovereign alliance, like the unspoken agreement between Trump and Putin that they are going after the same enemy. The same people trying to destroy Trump are the same people trying to destroy Putin. They have the same enemy. This is the same. It's the CIA. It's the same people. So, like when he said, there were a lot of like really great points that you brought up, Che, where Putin said something very insightful, and rather than like locking in on that and asking him to extrapolate and asking him to like expand on that further, Tucker kind of like went back to his talking points and like got a little hostile and challenged him. And I don't know if like challenging Putin was the right move. I think the move was a conversation, like Putin said. We're not here to do a talk show. We're here to do a real, genuine, sincere conversation. Let's talk about this and understand one another. And if we walk away with a better understanding, maybe we can get along like as cultures and nations. One example of that would be when Putin said that the UN charter was illegitimate. Like he was like, yeah, the UN charter is illegitimate. That's a pretty like incredible statement. I would have loved to have heard Tucker say like, wow, what do you mean by that? Can you explain that a little further? Instead, he went back to like, well, why did you do this in Ukraine? Like, it's like, come on, man, like react to what the guy's giving you. The guy's giving you great talking points. Ask him to expand on that, because that it would have been a much better conversation. And maybe you would have gotten some of the culture war stuff that Tate was talking about, maybe.
Yeah, he stuck with his points that he made previously, let's say, was prepared. Shay,
which were very productive, by the way. As you said, they were very basic. They were very low IQ kind of questions. They weren't like nuanced. Yeah.
Shay, the last question in 2-3 minutes. Putin spoke about Zelensky's position on the neo-Nazis, and I got the impression, was my impression, that he tried to find justification for Zelensky for supporting the neo-Nazis there. Like it was about realpolitik. He said Zelensky ran on a peace program in his presidential election, and when he reached to power, he realized that he shouldn't antagonize the neo-Nazi groups because they are so powerful. And in any ways, the Western governments will support these neo-Nazi groups there. So did you get the impression that Putin was giving Zelensky a rope or a lifeline from the charges of supporting the Nazis so that they could find a mutual ground to restart the peace negotiations between them?
Mm-hmm. Well, it's interesting. I'll give you a little story about Putin and Zelensky. I mean, at the start of the conflict, early in the conflict, Naftali Bennett, the ex-Israeli prime minister, traveled to Kiev to, try to broker a peace. And he was involved in the Turkish peace deal as well, I think, on the fringes of that. Naftali Bennett, who's, a capable politician, but he's also an unpleasant individual in many ways, but that's another day's work. But Bennett recounts that Zelensky rang him and said, look, I'm not coming to Kiev to take part in any talks. I'm keeping out of Kiev. I'm staying in my bunker. He was in a bunker, we believe, in an air defense bunker. Mm-hmm. And he made Bennett ring Putin and contact Putin. And he did, and this has been confirmed, and said, look, he won't take part in the discussions because he's scared you're going to have him killed. There'd be an airstrike or whatever. So Zelensky sought assurances from the Kremlin that they wouldn't target him in Bankova Street, and the FSB know exactly where Zelensky is right now. And Andrew Tate, never interrupt your enemy when he's making a mistake. Arguably, the greatest asset to the Russian project in Ukraine is Vladimir Zelensky, a completely ill-equipped non-politician with a big ego, dismissing generals, wading in. There's something of the Führer about him. He's got this God complex. I mean, this is the biggest, when it comes to Zelensky, remember, this is the biggest, performance of a lifetime for an actor, essentially, comedian. Yeah. And why would that actor want the stage on which he's standing now, the greatest Churchillian character in the world? All this drivel that the Western media peddles about this man. These fawning interviews, it's just hilarious. I mean, why would he now look to sign a peace deal, because he will immediately be removed in an election. Everybody knows in Ukraine and Russia that as soon as there's an election in Ukraine, Zelensky is finished. So you got to get your head around the picture. So he asked permission to go back to Kiev, much like Joe Biden and the State Department, the White House. It's been confirmed that before Joe Biden went for his heroic visit to Ukraine last year, they also asked the Russians, was it okay if he went, and for guarantees that they wouldn't blow him to pieces. So that's this kind of bizarre reality with the West when it comes to what's happening, and with Russia. And as Putin said in his interview, there are many mechanisms of discussion and complex connection between the Russian FSB and the CIA, and they go on every day on numerous issues. So it's important that we understand, that that's the real politic of what's actually happening here. And regarding Zelensky, I think I don't know. I mean, who would want that job now? Who would take it? I mean, it's not exactly got much job security, let's say.
Very similar dynamic to Biden and Trump. I mean, Zelensky's the best thing to ever happen to Putin, and his narrative deployment. Biden is the best thing to ever happen to Trump. Almost like Biden is working for Trump.
I said that yesterday. That all Biden has to do right now, or all Trump has to do, is just keep quiet until election. Say nothing. Throw a few hats in the crowd, wave, just do a dance, do the little thing, and it's in the bag. Yep. If Trump now wades into some debate or screws up somehow, he will pluck defeat from the jaws of victory. Exactly. I mean, it's probably the most, utterly incapable, sad spectacle to see Joe Biden. Anybody that even believes he can get 4 more meters across a car park, forget about 4 more years. But it's also indicative of American society right now, to me, that people could actually believe that this man, with his lack of mental acuity, this frail man, that he could actually be seen as a sentient leader of one of the greatest powers on earth, that American people can actually convince themselves that that's the case. If they can convince themselves that Joe Biden is a capable, cognitively aware, sentient president for their great republic, if they can believe that, they can believe anything about Russia and China.
Yeah,
that's true.
Gordon and Shay, thank you very much, brothers, for joining me today on Syriana Analysis. I just want to mention one information. Today's live streaming was the number of the viewers were the highest since I started these live streamings. Thanks to you guys. Thank you so much for your valuable information, guys. The links for the social media accounts are in the description below. And I would really appreciate it if you can just hit the like button. And if you want to support my independent work, you can become a patron. The link is scrolling on the screen, patreon.com/Syriana Analysis. And I will see you on Monday. Tomorrow I cannot do live streaming due to family matter, guys. So we will see you on Monday, 5 p.m. Central European time. Peace be upon you.